Hey fellas, how are you? Today we're going into the newest Fazbear Frights book, the second to last one. Can you believe it? We're almost there. This is called Friendly Face, and the opinion on a lot of these books has gone down lately a lot. I'm actually making a video on it soon about just what I think on the huge negative opinions surrounding these books lately. And that's coming out soon, but until then, I'm going to keep reading them because I still find enjoyment in them, even if I don't agree with every decision that's made about them. We'll see how I feel after the second story in this book, Sea Bonnies. That one's gonna be fun. But before we do any of that, let's cover the first story, Friendly Face. Okay, let's go, shall we? Edward's cereal bowl hit the floor and shattered. Milk and soggy flakes splashed his jeans. Edward jumped up, frowned, and looked around, reminding himself of where he was. Right, he was in the kitchen. Old-fashioned red laminate counters, bright white farm-style sink, retro fridge and stove, smells of ripening bananas, and the alfalfa his mom put in her energy smoothie. He'd been eating breakfast until he got lost in his book. He looked down and stared at the remains of his bowl. "Edward, you have to be more careful," his mom snapped. Edward glanced at her. His mom looked harried, as usual. A few auburn strands had come loose from the twist she always wore her hair in. She was shaking her head and rubbing her temples as she stared up at the mess on the scuffed hardwood floor. "How'd that get down there?" Edward asked. His mom sighed. She leaned over and started picking up pieces of green stoneware. Edward bent over to help her, and their heads bumped together. "Ow!" they shouted in unison. His mother straightened and scowled at him. On one hand, she held the stoneware shards. In the other hand, she probed the red spot on her forehead. Edward opened his mouth to apologize, but a look from his mother silenced him. She walked to the trash can under the sink and dropped in the broken cereal bowl. Edward grabbed a napkin from the round kitchen table, squatted, and started wiping up the milk and cereal. "Edward." His mom held out a wet rag for him to use on the floor. He took it and started swiping this way and that. His swift motions flung bits of cereal farther across the floor. His mom sighed again. "Just leave it, I'll get it. Go brush your teeth, you're going to miss the bus." Edward stood and seized the moment to apologize. "Sorry, I don't know how that bowl fell." His mom opened her mouth, closed it, took a deep breath, and then reached out and ruffled his hair. He squirmed. He wished she wouldn't do that. It was like she couldn't tell the difference between 8th grade and 8. She still tried to treat him like he was a little kid, even though he'd been 13 for months. He was a teenager now. He needed her to get that. He looked at her tight face. Now probably wasn't the best time to try and explain it, though. Edward and his mom had been on their own for a long time, and for the most part they were close. They looked alike, too, which was more embarrassing. Even with the subtle makeup his mom wore, her hazel eyes, small nose, wide mouth, and strong jaw were almost mirror images of his own features. It was uncanny. His hair was the exact color of hers, too, but his hair wasn't long enough to twist. "Well, my little science geek," his mom said. "What was that question you were asking the other day about unstoppable forces? What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? That question?" Edward scrunched up his face. What did the irresistible force paradox have to do with anything? His mom nodded. "That one. Well, I can't answer it, but I do know what happens when a cereal bowl, pushed to the edge of the table, meets the elbow of an inattentive boy who is reading at breakfast instead of eating." "Not a boy," Edward said. "Fine. Teen. Same result. You need to focus on one thing at a time, Edward. You get in a hurry, and that's why you're so prone to accidents. If you want to live through your teen years..." Oh, is that foreshadowing right there? Is this the story telling us in a very secret way that he's not going to live through his teen years, that he's going to die maybe by the end of the story? Potentially. I guess we'll have to see. If you want to live through your teen years, you need to pay attention. "Well, I was paying attention to what I was reading," Edward said. "That's not..." His mom sighed again. "Go pay attention to brushing your teeth." Edward shrugged and returned to leave the kitchen. "Your book?" his mother said. "Oh." He turned and took it from her. She shook her head and smiled at him in the lopsided way she had whenever he messed something up. It was like she was saying, "You're a hopeless case, but I love you anyway." Edward hesitated, then hugged his mom. "Sorry." "Edward, are you listening?" Edward looked up at Mrs. Sterling, who frowned at him from the front of the class. "Sorry?" "I asked if you could please grab the iron filings from the cabinet. You're the closest to it." "Oh, sure." Edward turned around and opened the metal cabinet behind him. They'd been talking about the unstoppable force/immovable object thing again at the start of class today, and his brain couldn't stop chewing on it. Thanks to his many questions about it, Mrs. Sterling had assigned a paper on the subject. He thought about how he was going to organize his essay while he grabbed the filings. Okay, so now we're going to witness the power of magnets, Mrs. Sterling announced. She beamed at the class. Mrs. Sterling was middle-aged, with a round face and a wide smile. She always looked like she was having the time of her life, even when she wasn't. She presided like a game show host over the classroom, which was full of desks, lab tables, cabinets of vials and beakers, chairs, diagrams, photos of scientific anomalies. They all littered the walls, an endless number of distractions for Edward's curious mind. "Edward, since you're up here," Mrs. Sterling said, "why don't you sprinkle those filings on that magnet?" She pointed to a flat gray box-like contraption on her desk, before turning away to write something on the blackboard. He tried to see what she was writing while he opened the vial he'd grabbed, and without looking, sprinkled a mound of the filings on the flat surface. "Thank you, Edward," Mrs. Sterling said. "You can return to your seat." Edward nodded and headed back to his desk. "Okay, here we go." She flipped the switch on a fan that was set up in front of the magnet. Suddenly, the front of the class was pelted with tiny black particles, and everyone started to sneeze. Mrs. Sterling, being nearest to her desk, sneezed the hardest. She also closed her eyes tightly. One of the girls in the front row squealed. Another cried out, "My eyes!" "Turn off the fan," a boy shouted. Mrs. Sterling, her eyes still shut, groped around the fan and ended up knocking it over. Edward sneezed and his eyes started to burn. What had happened? "Are you sure those were the iron filings you grabbed?" his best friend Jack asked, pulling his shirt up over his nose. Edward wiped at his runny nose. "Sure, He cringed and turned to look at the cabinet. The vial of iron filings was still sitting there. He'd grabbed the pepper Mrs. Sterling had used in their surface tension experiment a couple days before. "Everyone out," Mrs. Sterling commanded in a shrill tone. She was staggering around, tears streaming from her eyes, but she was still smiling. "Klutz face strikes again," one of the boys shouted as they all ran from the classroom. "Ha ha! What a good joke, I must say." How is it that in all of these stories, and just in media in general, no one can figure out an actual good insult for bullies to use, like these characters who are clearly supposed to be mean? They always have, like, the lamest insults. Insults that would, ironically, if they were real, probably get them bullied. Who calls someone klutz face? No one does that. I don't know. It's a thing. Continuing on. "Sorry," Edward said when he joined his classmates in the hallway. He stopped and shrugged. There was no point in trying to explain, so he just repeated, "Sorry." "I wonder how many times a day I say sorry," Edward said to Jack as their bus trundled away from the school that afternoon. "Sorry?" Jack tugged on his earbuds and turned his smiling face toward Edward. "I didn't hear you. Could you please repeat what you said?" "Nothing." Jack shrugged and put his earbuds back in. His smile stayed in place. Jack was nearly always smiling. One reason for that was his nips were... Nips? That's not what I meant to say. His lips were naturally upturned. Okay, anyway, continuing. Another was that Jack was just generally happy all the time. Edward had never known anyone as good-natured as Jack. His warm brown eyes already had faint smile crinkles at the corners. Edward gazed at the golden spiral on Jack's baggy t-shirt for a second, and wondered what Jack was listening to. It was always an audiobook, never music. Then he turned and stared at the window. An audiobook? Like what I'm recording right now? Cool. Sorry. The junior high school Edward and Jack attended was a part of a complex that also included the town's high school. The complex had been built just the year before to replace the old middle school, which had succumbed to a mold problem deemed too expensive to remedy. The new school complex was nice, but due to a zoning issue, it had been built a few miles outside of town. Because of this, the first part of the bus ride home went through a relatively wild area, or at least Edward thought of it as wild. The route cut through a thick forest. Tall fir trees pressed up against one another at the edge of the gravel on the roadside. Most of Edward's classmates loved the woods. On Monday morning in homeroom, they'd talk about catching crawdads in the creek, floating all day in a deep swimming pool a half-mile or so from the school, and playing King of the Hill on whatever the local legends said were old burial mounds. Edward, however, didn't like the forest. It was too dark, too easy to get lost in. Is that foreshadowing? Potentially he's going to get lost in the forest later in the story. I wonder. It left a chill on the back of his neck, the idea of the trees closing in, dampening the sound so no one could hear you scream. Edward shifted on the hard bus seat. The padding under the vinyl was worn, and for an uncomfortable moment he felt swallowed by his thoughts. When he repositioned, he flung out an elbow. "Ow!" Jack said. Sorry, Edward winced. There it was again. He should start counting. Was the endless repetition of sorry a mental condition, like Tourette's or something? Maybe he had a neurological issue and that was why his elbows and his body in general were always getting him in trouble. He shifted again, and this time he kicked Jack in the ankle. Jack jerked his leg away and studied Edward. Sorry, Edward said. Jack again removed his earbuds. This time he put them away. Do you have something weighing on you? You've been weird all day. As opposed to other days, do you think there's any day I'm not weird? Jack quirked his full lips and rubbed his nose. You make a valid point. He leaned over and bumped shoulders with Edward. But it takes weird to know weird. One of the girls seated in front of Edward and Jack whirled around and gave him a look. You're both weird. Oh! Oh! That's a good one. That's a really good one. Wow. Really great stuff. Love this. Edward flushed. The girl, Julia, was one of the most popular kids in his school, which meant she was the antithesis of him. Most days, that didn't really bother him. He and Jack had decided a long time ago that they existed in their separate universe. They might have to hang around in this one, like the Loch Ness Monster, which Edward was convinced lived in another dimension, and occasionally came through a wormhole to visit this one. Why else would the monster be spotted only 10 times a year? That's still a lot. Is that true? Is that how many times people say they spot the Loch Ness Monster? Do you guys believe in the Loch Ness Monster, by the way? Okay, I know I'm getting really sidetracked, but I'm just going to ask this really quick, and then we'll move on. I know I keep interrupting myself. I'm going to stop now, but let me know, because I think I do. I believe in the Loch Ness Monster. I think it's a real thing. Let me know what you guys think. Maybe, if you want. He looked into Julia's pretty eyes. Okay. He wondered if his theory would interest her. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, she rolled her bright blue irises. Thanks to you two, we have to write papers on why it's impossible for an unstoppable force to exist in the same universe as an immovable object. Jack's smile widened, and he bounced in his seat. What's the issue with that? It's quite entertaining to think about. Just imagine if this bus had infinite energy, and shut up, Julia turned around. Edward stared at the way her wavy black hair hung over from the back of her head, like a waterfall cascading over rocks on a moonlit night. He glanced at Jack, remembering Jack's laughter when Edward had shared his feelings with him a couple weeks before. Have you lost interest in the sci-fi genre and developed one for romantic fiction? Jack had sputtered before guffaws. She lives in a different plane of existence, Edward. It's not possible. For reasons Edward didn't understand, this universe, not the one he and Jack were from, had its basis in a couple of strange equations. The first was this. Interest in science minus interest in sports equals weird. The second one goes like this. Weird plus small equals outcast. Who decided this stuff? He wasn't sure. It seemed like nerds generally made more money. They created more stuff that made the world better. So who invented this popularity calculus, and who distributed the memo about it? It just seemed to be something everyone knew. You coming? Jack asked. Edward blinked and looked around. Several kids were getting off the bus. Edward looked out the window. This was their stop. Jack and Edward stood, but something wet and gooey smacked Edward in the cheek. Fazgoo? Before he could reach up, the gooey object, chewed gum, bounced onto his chest and stuck to the left eye of his smiley-faced t-shirt. He tried to flick it off, but it clung. He grabbed it, almost gagging at the grossness of the slick spittle covering the gum. Ew. In spite of that human slime, the gum stuck to his fingers. Come on, Jack urged. He was already standing in the aisle. Edward sighed and pulled on the gum. He got most of it off his shirt and had to hold it as they got off the bus. That's weird. That's weird that that's a thing in this story, that they specifically mentioned that some gum gets stuck to him. Maybe there's a different reason for it, but I think that might be Fazgoo. I haven't finished this story yet. This is the first time I'm reading it, so I guess we'll see. He was tempted to try and wipe it on a seat as he went down the aisle, but that would be wrong. He'd wait until he got out, and then he'd wipe it on a rock or something. He looked around. No way of knowing who threw the gum. Anyone in this universe might have. As soon as Edward was off the bus, the driver, Don, a big semi-retired man with curly gray hair, called out, "Have a good one." Edward waved at Don as the bus doors closed with a thump. The bus belched exhaust and rumbled away. Jack carefully centered his stack of books on the front of his belly and asked, "What would you like to do this afternoon?" Edward watched the other kids meander down the street. He stepped away from the curb and reached out to pick a rock up from the flower bed at the edge of Mrs. Phillips' yard. After a glance at her window to make sure she wasn't watching, he used the rock to scrape the gum from his fingers. Then he bent down to reposition the rock, gum side down, exactly where he'd found it. As he set the rock back in place, he heard a faint sound. Edward froze and listened. What was that? The bus was nearly at the end of the block. When it turned the corner, the noise of the engine grew fainter. and the sound coming from Mrs. Phillips' flower bed got louder. It seemed to be a cross between a squeak and a chirp. Was it an injured bird, a chipmunk? Edward dropped to his knees and began looking around under the big rhododendron shrub guarding Mrs. Phillips' seasonal plantings. Because it was January, the flower bed held no flowers at the moment. Instead, it was a collection of winter-clad gnomes, all of which wore hand-knit sweaters Mrs. Phillips had made herself. Whatever was making the sound made it again. It was louder now. Tree, tree. What are you doing? Jack asked. Shh, don't you hear that? Hear what? Edward ducked his head under the bush and gently repositioned a gnome wearing a ski cap. The sound shifted to a pronounced hiss, and he yanked his hand back. I think there's a snake in there, he said. Well, then why are you placing your hand in that vicinity? The hissing stopped and the sound returned. Only this time, it was more of a mwee than a chee. Hey, I heard that, Jack said. A snake couldn't make that sound. Jack leaned over, brushed a spot on the sidewalk off, and positioned his stack of books at the edge of the flower bed. He knelt next to Edward and leaned in to peer past the gnomes. Together, Edward and Jack moved another gnome. From beyond their hands, something hissed again and then emitted another wee. Jack held aside a rhododendron branch, and 2 yellow eyes peered out at them. It's a kitten, Jack exclaimed. His usual smile turned into a huge grin. The kitten said again, mwee. Hello, kitty, Jack said in a soothing tone. It's a pleasure to meet you, little guy. You have no reason to be afraid. We have no intention of hurting you. Edward leaned over and craned to see past Jack's outstretched hand. It was dark under the bush, and the only part of the kitten that was clear was its eyes. Come on, little buddy, Jack coaxed, his voice an octave higher than Edward had ever heard it. We can assist you. Jack turned to whisper to Edward. I don't suppose you have any cat food in your backpack. Edward snorted. The kitten hissed. Jack whispered again. I don't think Faraday likes you. Faraday? Edward whispered back. You know, Michael Faraday, the famous scientist. He founded 2 laws of electrochemistry. Jack was still whispering. The kitten had stopped hissing. Of course, him. Edward grinned. Every day Jack told Edward something he didn't know. Edward was pretty sure he'd learned more from Jack than he did at school. A truck engine revved, and Edward turned to frown at it. On the other side of the neighborhood, some developer was putting in a new subdivision. Heavy machinery had been cutting through Edward and Jack's neighborhood for the last week or so. According to Edward's mother, dump trucks would be going back and forth for months. The truck's roar faded away. Someone yelled out. The kitten opened its mouth and let out another mee. Mwee. I thought kittens meowed, Edward said. Kittens have a wide variety of vocalizations, Jack replied. Their communication is as idiosyncratic as that of the average human. Although the I really hope this isn't annoying for you guys, but I just cannot read this. Although the homogeneity of our classmates' utterances argues against human singularity. Edward frowned and opened his mouth to ask Jack to explain what he was talking about, but Jack went on. I recommend that you retreat for a moment. I believe I am establishing a bond with Faraday. We'll include you as long as we've solidified our connection. Sure. Edward dropped from his knees to his butt and scooted backward. Even though it was cold outside, the cement felt warm through his jeans. He glanced up at the bright sun, then closed his eyes and watched spots dance behind his eyelids. He listened to his friends establishing a bond. He grinned. Edward and Jack had been friends since they were babies. Could babies even be friends? According to his mother, Jack and Edward played together before they could walk. He wondered what they did. Did they drool on each other? At any rate, to say that Edward and Jack grew up together might be overstating things a bit. Neither of them had managed to reach anything approaching a normal height for their age. Consequently, if they'd been relentlessly teased from the moment they entered school, they were relentlessly teased now. But honestly, even if Jack wasn't short, he would still invite derision. It was the way he talked. It was the way he thought. Take the question about cat food, for example. He wasn't kidding when he asked that. Jack got into physics when he was barely old enough to read. His understanding of quarks and atoms dwarfed that of any of their teachers. He loved talking about duality, the fact that quantum entities exist as waves and particles at the same time. It's all infinite possibility, Jack loved to say. He thought anything was possible, like that his best friend might be carrying cat food, even though he didn't have a cat. Edward, Jack said. Edward opened his eyes. Jack knelt in front of him, holding a scrawny black kitten. Meet Faraday, Jack said in a quiet voice. Faraday, this is Edward. He's okay, he's just a bit of a klutz. I suggest you stay away from his elbows. The kitten was purring. He and Jack had apparently completed their bond. Jack's head was bent, the kitten tucked under his broad chin. For a second it was hard to see where the kitten's fur stopped and Jack's hair began. Jack's hair was as black as the kitten was. Edward shifted his gaze from Jack to the kitten. Hey, Faraday, he said. He held a finger in front of the kitten's tiny nose. The kitten sniffed Edward's finger and kept purring. "He might like you after all," Jack said. Is there a reason you've named a kitten that isn't yours?" Edward said. Jack shrugged. "He needs a name." "Should we take him to the shelter?" Jack shook his head. "No, I don't believe that would be best for him." Faraday stopped purring. Jack murmured to him and scratched him behind the ears. "I think we should keep him," Jack said. "My mom won't." "I know. Mine will, as long as we take care of him." "We?" "Well, you found him. You have to be one of his dads." "I haven't exactly had a lot of role models for fatherhood." "And I do?" Jack said. "True." Edward's dad left when Edward was 3. He lived on the other side of the country with his second wife and 3 new kids. At Christmas and on Edward's birthday, he'd send a stupid card with $20 inside. Jack's dad was still in the picture, but he was a long-haul trucker, and when he was home, all he wanted to do was watch sports, drink sodas, and eat junk food. He didn't understand Jack, and had joked on occasion that he wasn't convinced Jack was actually, well, his son. Another car went by. "Hey, freak," some jerk shouted. "Forget the way home?" Good one. Oh, you really showed them. Edward looked up and recognized a couple of the guys who lived up the street, both part of the group that played baseball in the streets in the summer. "Let's go," he said to Jack. Jack held out Faraday. "You take him so I can get my books." Edward gingerly accepted the furry bundle, sensing an expectation of a hiss or something worse. He wasn't used to animals. He liked them, but his mom never let him have one. He had no idea how to even hold a kitten, let alone how to take care of it. Edward didn't think Jack knew either. He sounded pretty confident about his mom letting him keep Faraday, but the only pet he'd ever had was a goldfish he named Cousteau. Cousteau? Just a year ago, they'd held an hour-long memorial service after Jack found Cousteau floating upside down in his bowl. Edward had thought an hour-long service was excessive, but Jack pointed out that Cousteau had been alive longer than Jack and Edward. Jack's mom had bought Cousteau for Jack's nursery before he was born, so he deserved the appropriate respect. I would not think goldfish live that long. I've had some, and they do not last that long in my experience. Maybe I'm just bad at keeping them alive. Edward looked into Faraday's eyes. The kitten blinked at him. He gently stroked the cat's fur. It was dirty and felt stiff. "Okay," Jack said, "let's go." "Where are we going? Home?" "Feel free to pursue your own agenda. My agenda is caring for our new cat." True to Jack's prediction, his mom had no trouble with Faraday. This wasn't all that surprising. Mrs. Weston was a physics professor, which is why Jack couldn't be blamed for his obsession with duality. And if she wasn't in the classroom teaching, she was on her computer. "Publish or perish," she said, whenever Edward commented on how hard she worked. Mrs. Weston wasn't all that aware of what was going on in the world beyond her work. Jack's house had always been a mess when he was little. Now it was clean, but only because he cleaned it. He also taught himself how to cook because he got tired of microwave dinners. Now Jack was teaching himself how to take care of a cat. 3 weeks after they had found Faraday, he had not only settled into the Weston household, he was the boss of it, or at least the boss of Jack. Now the proud user of a state-of-the-art kitty litter station, cat tower, and several cat beds, Faraday looked and acted like a very different critter than the one Edward and Jack had found. Edward's poster had resulted in no calls about Faraday, and he was relieved about that. If the posters had led to someone taking Faraday away, he wasn't sure Jack would have forgiven him. And truthfully, Edward wouldn't have forgiven himself. He was in love with Faraday every bit as much as Jack was. This was why he now spent even more time at Jack's house. "How come you and Jack never hang out here anymore?" his mother asked the day before. Edward had been trying to read the latest horror story by his favorite author. He answered her simply, "Faraday." "What's a Faraday?" His mother reached out and snatched the book from his grasp. Edward gritted his teeth, but he didn't say anything. His mom set down a bowl of chicken soup in front of him. He reached for the crackers, almost knocked his milk over, and caught it just in time. His mom gave him a look that he ignored. "Don't you remember me telling you about the kitten we found, the one I made posters for?" "Oh, sure. The kitten's called Faraday?" Edward nodded and slurped his soup. "Why?" his mom asked. Edward explained about Michael Faraday and told her he was pretty sure the kitten was smart enough to develop some laws of electrochemistry on his own, if he had opposable thumbs. The kitten had an extraordinary ability to get whatever he wanted. A case in point that was happening right now. Jack's dad had come home from his latest stretch on the road the night before. According to Jack, his dad had gone straight to bed and hadn't noticed the new addition to the family. Minutes before, however, he'd flopped inside the family room and sat down on his leather recliner. Reaching for the remote, his hand instead encountered a handful of kitten. What the hell? Jack and Edward, who'd been sitting on the room's big brown rug using a laser pointer to amuse Faraday, froze. Jack flicked off the laser pointer. Faraday looked around, trying to find his missing prey. When he couldn't locate it, Faraday said, "Merp." Jack was right about the variety of a kitten's sounds. Faraday had an extensive language, much of which Jack and Edward understood. Merp meant the exact same thing Mr. Weston had just said. What the hell? Or maybe Faraday's version was more colorful. Edward wasn't sure. "Where'd the cat come from?" Mr. Weston asked, as he popped open a can of soda. He set the soda down next to a coaster Jack had ineffectually placed on the end table next to the recliner. "We found him," Jack said, his usual smile wavering slightly. "Mom said we could keep him." Edward was fascinated by how Jack's normal, complex speech patterns became simple sentences when he spoke to his dad. Poor Jack. He tried to relate to his dad, it just didn't do much good. "She did, huh?" Mr. Weston scowled. Not only did Jack's dad not share Jack's personality or interests, he looked nothing like Jack. Mr. Weston was broad-shouldered and tall. His hair was black like Jack's, but his features were totally different. He had big features, large eyes, a broad nose, a jutting chin. "What good is a cat?" Mr. Weston asked. Faraday looked at Jack's dad and said, "Mop." Then he stepped on the remote, right on the power button. The TV came on. It was on a cooking channel. Before Mr. Weston could reach for the remote to change the channel, Faraday flicked his tail and stepped on the remote once again. The channel changed, and a college basketball game appeared on the screen. Jack's dad looked at the cat. "Not bad, cat." Faraday said meep, and jumped off the end table. He knew when his work was done. And that was apparently that. Mr. Weston settled in to enjoy the game, and Jack, Edward, and Faraday retreated to Jack's room. The addition of Faraday to Jack's room meant that Jack had to make a few adjustments. First, there was the aforementioned kitty litter station, cat tower, and beds. 3 beds, to be exact. But technically one of them was a bed, the fluffy kind that was like a poof, with a hole in the middle for Faraday to sink into. The other 2 weren't exactly beds. One was a sleeping cave, kind of like a soft igloo, and the other was a hammock. In addition to these basic kitty accoutrements, Jack and Edward had spent the better part of the previous 3 weeks turning Jack's bedroom into a kiddie play paradise. Putting their combined physics knowledge and Edward's fledgling interest in woodworking together, they built a series of platforms, ramps, and kiddieways all over the walls of the room. The network of feline paths ran up over Jack's book-stuffed shelving, and then circled the room at a level just a foot or so below the ceiling. In addition to these thoroughfares, Edward and Jack built a series of chain reaction mechanisms designed to keep a feline occupied for hours. Faraday loved all of this, but what he loved most was Edward and Jack themselves. Faraday was not just a smart kitty, he was a social kitty. He liked playing group games like Catch Me If You Can, Keep Away, which usually involved him taking off with something the humans didn't want him to have, and hide and seek. Faraday was far too good at all 3 games. He quite often tried the patience of his keepers, to the point where they wanted nothing to do with him, but that's when he'd pull out his superpower. Faraday was, above all else, a cuddle master. Not aloof like any cat Edward had heard about, Faraday loved to snuggle and be stroked. His purr power was off the charts. Settled for the moment on Edward's lap, he had his purr cranked up to 11. Jack sank into his desk chair and straightened his schoolbooks. He grinned at Edward. "Wasn't that the most empathic relation between human and feline you've ever witnessed?" Edward stroked Faraday's back. Faraday raised his tail into the vaguely question mark-shaped happy position and said, "Parble." "It was pretty amazing," Edward said. Speaking of amazing, the difference in the way Faraday felt between the day they'd found him and now was pretty remarkable. In just 21 days, Faraday had gone from bony and rough to soft and silky. Now, perfectly filled out, Faraday was the picture of health, and his fur shined. Jack claimed this was just because he used a little of his product, some kind of glop that supposedly made your hair glossy on Faraday. Edward wasn't sure you were supposed to use human hair products on cats, but he didn't say anything. Faraday didn't seem to be suffering in any way. He rubbed under Faraday's chin. Faraday shoved his head against Edward's fingers and said, "Plurmph." "I think we should implement a training program for him," Jack said. Edward blinked. "Can you train a cat?" "Of course. I found a book online. It's written by a woman who makes her living from a cat act that tours the country. I'm not sure I approve of using cats in such a blatantly self-interested entrepreneurial way, but her skills are impressive nonetheless." "It's not total self-interest," Edward said. I assume she uses the money to take care of her cats, too. A fair point. I'm up for training, Edward said. What do we need to do? Well, according to the book, we'll start with simple suggestions and then move on to more complex ones. Suggestions? I object to the use of the word commands. Okay. Given his genius level, Jack said, gesturing at Faraday, I'm sure he'll know a host of suggestions in no time. I'm sure. Jack's prediction proved to be true. With 6 months remaining in the school year, after just 3 months of training, Faraday was turning into a kiddie performer extraordinaire. Whenever Jack or Edward said something to Faraday, like, could you sit, please, Faraday would sit upright in a look at me, aren't I handsome posture. If you said, could you please come here, Faraday would trot over as happy as you please. Please stay where you are if you could, would freeze Faraday in place. Similar polite requests could get Faraday to lie down, to go and get something, to wave his paw, to slap a high five, to roll over, to spin in a circle, to jump, to leap through your arms and bow. It was pretty awesome, Edward thought. Now they were moving on to something akin to dog agility training. Out of space in Jack's room to build anything else, Jack and Edward asked his mother for permission to build an agility course for Faraday in the backyard. Because neither Mrs. or Mr. Weston cared about the wild wooded area behind their house, she agreed. They often played with Faraday in the backyard on sunny days. Because he'd never shown any interest in being anywhere Edward and Jack weren't, they were sure he was safe back there. We'll never leave him outside to weather the elements or the wilds of the forest on his own, Jack had said the first time they went outside to chase Faraday around. Edward agreed. He'd even been nervous about coming outside to play at all. The first time they'd done it had been in response to Mr. Weston's complaint about the racket Faraday was making running all over the house. Faraday was no longer kitten-sized, and though he was still a cuddle master, his longer limbs and extended body often got him into trouble. He was as prone at knocking things down to the floor as Edward was. The only difference between Edward and Faraday was that no one was constantly telling Faraday to be careful. On a warm day in early May, Edward carried several lengths of 2x12s into Jack's backyard. Surprisingly, Mr. Weston had helped Jack and Edward buy the lumber for the project. Edward theorized that Mr. Weston was thrilled his son had taken an interest in something manly like woodworking. Of course, no one told Mr. Weston that Edward would be doing all the building, and Mr. Weston didn't hang around long enough to find out. There was a baseball game on TV. Edward could faintly hear the game through an open window at the back of Jack's house, but it was mostly drowned out by the neighbor's lawnmower. The smell of freshly mowed grass wafted over from next door and mixed with the musty smell of the wet earth in the Westons' untended yard. I am of the opinion that we should first demarcate our layout with chalk, Jack said, when Edward showed him his plans for Faraday's agility course. Edward shrugged. That's fine. As Edward carried lumber and old tires and tubing this way and that, he realized that Jack's chalk markings would be the extent of Jack's contribution to the project. That, and pointing here and there as he instructed Edward on where to place various aspects of the course. While Edward and Jack planned Faraday's agility course, on the lookout for large leaves left over unraked from the fall. They were the next best thing to a laser pointer. Occasionally, a hefty breeze would toss some leaves around, keeping Faraday well amused while Jack planned and Edward got to work. In the weeks to come, Edward would wonder whether he'd missed some sign that afternoon, something to warn him of impending disaster. Was there a hint somewhere in the time they spent training Faraday, a whisper from the gods, any inkling of a threat? He'd often wasn't paying enough attention to the things he needed to, and the idea that he'd missed an important warning often kept him awake, wondering. Still, he could never pinpoint anything that would have alerted him to what was coming, and he supposed that was a good thing. In every paradise, a serpent lurked. In Edward and Jack and Faraday's paradise, the serpent was a butterfly. A pretty, orange, fluttering monarch butterfly. Edward spent hours studying butterflies after it happened. He wanted to know if the butterfly's appearance was a fluke, or whether he should have been aware that butterflies were out and about. It so happened that May was a perfectly normal time for butterflies. Monarchs, Edward learned during the terrible weeks after that day, lay their eggs in March and April. Their eggs hatch into larvae that grow into caterpillars, and then 2 weeks after that, the caterpillars find a nice sheltered place to start creating a chrysalis, from which the butterflies emerge. The first generation of monarchs only lives 2 to 6 weeks. They have a grand time eating during that short period, and then they die after laying eggs for the second generation of monarchs. It's that generation from which the evil emerged. Edward wished he'd known more about butterflies. He liked to think there would have been no way he and his best friends would have been outside if he'd known. But then, how would he have known that Faraday would think a butterfly was a colorful flying leaf? Faraday spotted the butterfly before Edward or Jack did. As soon as he did, he started scampering after it, the same way he chased a leaf. At first, Edward and Jack thought Faraday's antics were amusing. It was like watching a ballet, the lithe, sleek black cat leaping gracefully, the weightless butterfly swooping and diving, the way Faraday's paws reached for the butterfly, batting the air. It was adorable. But then their cat romped around the corner into the front yard. "Faraday, could you please come here?" Jack called, as Faraday rounded the side of the house. Faraday didn't come. And oh boy, do I think that's a perfect place to stop our story at the moment. I'm sure no one's going to be just waiting for the next part to find out what happens next. Oh well, time to end it there. Hope you guys enjoyed.